bread on the table, a fire in the hearth, a place to rest your head, a place to rest your heart. Coffee is brewing, pull up a chair, I'll listen to your stories, you're welcome here.
Jesus crossed over by boat. A large crowd met him at the seaside. One of the meeting place leaders named Jarius came. When he saw Jesus, he fell to his knees beside himself as he begged, "My dear daughter is at death's door. Come and lay hands on her so that she will get well and live." Jesus went with him, and the whole crowd tagging along, pushing and jostling him. A woman who had suffered a condition of hemorrhaging for 12 years, a long succession of physicians had treated her badly, taking all her money and leaving her worse off than before, had heard about Jesus. She slipped in from behind and touched his robe. She was thinking to herself, if I can put a finger on his robe, I can get well. The moment she did, the flow of blood dried up. She could feel the change and knew that her plague was over and done with. At the same moment, Jesus felt energy discharging from him, and he turned around to the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said, "What are you talking about? With this crowd pushing and jostling you, you're asking who touched me? Dozens have touched you." But he went on asking, looking around to see who had done it. The woman, knowing what had happened and knowing she was the one, stepped up in fear and trembling, knelt before him and gave him the whole story. Jesus said to her, "Daughter, you took a risk of faith, and now you're healed and whole. Live well, live blessed, be healed of your plague." While he had been talking, some people came from the leader's house and told him, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" Jesus overheard what they were talking about and said to the leader, "Don't listen to them, just trust me." He permitted no one to go in with him except Peter, James, and John. They entered the leader's house and pushed their way through the gossips looking for a story and neighbors bringing in casseroles. Jesus was abrupt. "Why all this busybody grief and gossip? The child isn't dead, she's sleeping." Provoked to sarcasm, they told him he didn't know what he was talking about. But when he had sent them all out, he took the child's father and mother, along with his companions, and entered the child's room. He clasped the girl's hand and said, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." At that, she was up and walking around. This girl was 12 years of age. They, of course, were all beside themselves with joy. But he gave them strict orders that no one was to know what had taken place in that room. And then he said, "Give her something to eat."
My first question to you is, who is Jarius? Probably a rabbi. Any other thought? Father? Any other thought? Well, he was more than a rabbi. He was actually the fella in charge of the worship services at the synagogue. He was almost like a moderator. It would be up to him to make sure that everything happened exactly as the law says. Everything would be placed according to the law. The procedure, when anybody spoke, how the scriptures were read, he was in charge of it all. It was an extremely prestigious position. And you can imagine this man, as powerful as he was, being on the church board, being a deacon, being on the future team future church team. Now this scene was fairly early in Jesus' ministry, and already though the storm clouds were gathering. Already people had heard about him and were not quite sure about him, and the gossip was already around. Jesus was probably close to the synagogue in Capernaum, which is one of the ones that he would have visited. And you better believe that as he had visited there, the church elders had all got together and were deciding what they were going to do about this rabbi, this itinerant fella who would just come off the road and teach. He had close friends there. They had family there. And the name Jesus either was one of great welcome or it was one of suspicion. What's he going to say now? What's he going to do? Is he going to push buttons enough that the higher-ups from Jerusalem are going to come in? Is the district executive and the Disciple and Reconciliation Board have to come in and sort us all out? What if the Romans got a little tired of this? And so all this type of conversation was already happening. And so here is this man. But he also had one overriding reason to seek out Jesus, and that was his daughter. All we know about her is she's 12. And if you remember, when your children were 12, you know how 12-year-olds can be. She was probably a little angel around her dad. But I imagine that when the time was right, she'd pull on her jeans and go run with everybody. So here was the ruler of the temple, of the synagogue. It was obvious that the daughter's condition was deteriorating rapidly. No specific reason is mentioned. But Mark is trying to tell us that she was about to embark upon the threshold of life. She could be married within the year. She could leave home and leave the village and leave everything and go on her own way. Everything in front of her. But she was dying. So Jarius, interestingly enough, does not go to the synagogue doctor, not to the doctor in town, not to anybody else. He goes to this one itinerant preacher that he must have heard along the way. Probably sat in the synagogue and listened to Jesus' words, and something got his attention. While all the rest of the board were over here, and the rabbis and other folk were over here kind of muttering to themselves, Jarius was paying attention, and he was caught in two worlds: the world of tradition and the new light in which he was a part of. And he goes out in desperation, and he goes in faith, and he implores Jesus to come to his house and to heal his daughter. And so moved is Jesus that he changes direction. He changes his plan to make sure that he goes to see his daughter. Do you believe that prayer can change the direction of God? Or do you believe perhaps that the stars are all set in their way and the events of life will happen? There's a couple of significant verses, if you have your Bibles open. Verses 22 and 23. he, Jairus, knelt at Jesus' feet and started begging him for help. Just look at that scene for a moment. Probably the most powerful man in town, begging, falling at Jesus' feet in all his robes and finery, falls at Jesus' feet. There is no pride in this man. He knows who Jesus is. He is risking everything as far as his career is concerned to go and just fall at Jesus' feet. So, asking you personally, what would you be willing to do if indeed your child got sick? Would you have sold your house to pay for medication? Would you have got a second job? Love is the greatest motivator of all time. According to a 1968, can you remember where you were in 1968? If you were. 83% of college students had as their number one priority a meaningful life philosophy. 1968. Meaningful life philosophy.
I'm convinced that if Jairus himself were ill, he would not have sought out Jesus' presence, his touch. He would have accepted it. But since it was his daughter, he was willing to prostrate himself right down on the ground and just beg for help. I think it teaches us a great lesson. That we all, whether we are a CEO or a PTA member, is that we all need one another. We need one another. You can be the tallest man in your business, in your company, but one day you'll need help. The redwoods are spectacular. They are wonderful, incredibly tall, but did you know that they have very shallow roots? The only reason they can't keep upright is that they blend their roots with another one next to them. And when we go through crisis, the only way we can stay standing sometimes is the person right next to us, keeping us strong, keeping us healthy, making sure we don't collapse. And when we're together as a church or a family, we provide the same sort of support. And there is Jairus down at the feet of Jesus, begging because he's absolutely desperate. And nobody in his synagogue probably would understand the horror he is going through. He's got nobody else to depend on. He chooses not to. He chooses to go to Jesus and just